Again, welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming and joining us in this seminar for vocations. You know that we have now this weekend three three seminars, and this is the first one. It's the first one. Um, we have Sister Brenda Dolphin. Father Tim Costello will introduce her in a moment, and she will talk a little bit about the journey of vocation and how can we help young people in that journey of discernment of their vocation. So again, please mute your microphones, and please, team, if you want to introduce Sister Brenda.
Yes. Thank you, Dani. Sister Brenda Dolphin, who will speak to us in a few moments, is a sister of mercy, and she has widespread experience as an educator, has worked as a secondary teacher, teaching languages and I think mathematics at some stage. Sister Brenda has also had a role in religious formation, and she worked for 20 years at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. And there she worked particularly in the Institute of Psychology, which was forming future formators for the church. Since 2006, Brenda has also been very much involved in the promotion of the cause of Catherine Macaulay, the founderess of the Sisters of Mercy. And since 2019, Brenda has served in leadership in her congregation in Ireland, in the South Central Province. So, Sister Brenda, it's a real privilege for us and a joy to us to be able to listen to what you have to say and to draw from your extensive experience on this topic of accompaniment and vocational ministry. So.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Thank you very much. It's indeed a privilege for me to speak to this group. It seems to be a group drawn from very many places around the globe. So I hope that what I have to say will be of some use to you in your ministry as vocation directors or formators, or in whatever aspect of formation that you work in. I'd like to address, as Tim said, one aspect of the vocation ministry, and that is the one-to-one personal accompaniment of the searcher. I call the person who is searching, discerning vocation, searching out if this aspect of is of God's will for him or for her. I would see, I've worked in formation, as Tim said, not alone at the level of the university, but also as a postulant directress, a novice mistress. I also had junior professed, and then I worked at congregational level as the liaison person for formation. And can I just say to you, I don't know what your experience is, but my experience is that one of the most rewarding aspects of vocation ministry is the privilege of accompanying another person on their vocation journey. Being a vocation minister is not easy. you're, as it were, at a very fulcrum point between the person who's searching or the new member and the congregation itself. So it's not an easy ministry, but it's indeed a very privileged one. The primary objective, the reason for vocation ministry to priesthood or religious life, really is to enable the person who is setting out on his or her journey of vocational discernment, to enable this person to grow very gradually into an ever deepening, joyful, and generous gift of himself or herself in all aspects of his life or her life. This self-gift of self to a loving God who calls the person into a relationship of love for service. And I think that's what's vital for us, is that we are walking side by side, enabling someone to give more and more of himself or herself to God. And the one-to-one vocational accompaniment personalizes the vocational journey. And what do I mean by personalizes it? It enables, first of all, the searcher or the person who is searching or discerning to move at his or her own pace. It challenges, in its format, it challenges the searcher to take personal responsibility for making every effort to respond to the call from God as he or she sees it. It also ensures personal responsibility for the struggle for conversion and transformation that is essential for growth into one's call. So it's a very vital ministry. And if the one-to-one accompaniment challenges the searcher to really take into his or her hands that whole journey of growth and deepening a relationship with God, it also challenges the vocation minister. And the challenge of the vocation minister is to disclose the beauty of following Jesus Christ and the value of the charism by which this is to be accomplished. Spiritually, the vocation minister will be familiar with the path of seeking the face of God, himself or herself, and will be sensitive to the action of grace in his life or her life. Humanly, the vocation minister is capable of in some way understanding another person, and out of his or her own experience recognizes the obstacles to growth that might be less obvious to the searcher. That is, if the vocation minister has been learning from his or her own experience of life as a priest or as a religious. And probably this is one of the most important things that we look for, is both in ourselves and in the person who is searching, are we learning from experience? It's very possible to have many experiences in life and not to learn from them? Have you ever said about yourself or about anybody else, will she never learn? And this is something that we know, that we do learn from some of our experiences, but sometimes we don't. And if you're looking at a new member, a searcher, and you want to see if after a period of time they are growing or developing in the response to the call, you'll see it in the fact that they are learning from the experiences that they have. So I'd like to, in this short talk that we have, I'd just like to look at the why of vocational accompaniment. What is it actually? And how do you do it? There's also another aspect there as well to the who, but I would leave that for now. I don't think we'd have enough time. And just before I look at the why of vocational accompaniment, just a little look at the history of the concept of one-to-one personal accompaniment in the whole vocation process, because since Vatican II, that's what now, nearly 60 years, personalizing the vocational journey has been increasingly highlighted in Vatican documents on preparation for priesthood or for religious life. The emphasis on this personalizing the journey began with Sacerdotalis Celibatus in 1967, followed by a guide to formation in priestly celibacy in 1974. And while these documents refer to personalizing accompaniment in the area of sexuality, one by one and gradually, Vatican documents began to refer to the whole person in the vocation process. In particular, the documents that followed Pastores Dabo Vobis in 1992, all the documents refer to the educator, that is the vocation minister, with his role of counseling and guiding the person as the new member or the searcher gradually moves into trying to discern if this is the way God is really asking of me. So I just mentioned that as a history in the whole movement of the church, the importance of personalizing through a one-to-one accompaniment, the formation process or the search process for the searcher has been highlighted very gradually. Let's look at, first of all, the why of one-to-one accompaniment. Why would you do it? Particularly if you have a number of new members or a number of people who are searching at the same time. And I think it's very important for us as vocation ministers to remember this. The person searching, or the person in formation, or whatever you like to name it, the person searching and the church mutually discern a vocation. And I think we've got to be very clear on this, that it's the formation process, the initial vocation movement is a process of discernment. And it is the vocations director's responsibility that the searcher knows this from the outset. Sometimes a person can start on the road to priesthood or religious life and think that because they have decided that they want to do this, that they're going to make final profession or they're going to be ordained. that cannot be allowed. You cannot let them go ahead thinking that. It's vital that every new member or every searcher understands that as he or she sets out, it's on a road of discerning. The vocation director presents respectfully the teaching of the church in relation to priesthood and religious life, the needs of the local and the universal church, and the charism of the congregation as the need arises. And then that means that both the searcher, who gradually opens himself up or herself up to the vocations minister, it means that both the searcher and the vocations director respectfully search together to see if God is calling this particular person to this specific way of life. In Pastoris Dabo Vobis number 16, we read that, or we learn that, the discernment must allow for the searcher to be accompanied on his path to acquiring those moral and theological virtues which are necessary for living in coherence and interior freedom, the total gift of his life, so as to be a servant of the church as communion. So why of vocational accompaniment is in order to be able to walk closely with and to allow the searcher to discern gradually, step by step, day by day, if this is really what God is calling me to. Secondly, what exactly do we mean when we talk about vocational accompaniment? What exactly is it? It is a face-to-face, if that is possible. It's not always possible, but if it is, it's a face-to-face, one-to-one meeting between the searcher and the vocational director. And when a searcher or a person in formation agrees to enter into a discernment process, is willing to have a one-to-one accompaniment, in that sense, he makes an agreement with the vocation minister to meet at regular intervals. And these meetings are never missed unless for exceptional circumstances. And this is a very practical thing, that if I, as a vocation minister, agree with a searcher, a person who wants to discern her or his vocation, we agree to meet at regular intervals, and those meetings are not skipped or not missed except for very exceptional circumstances. And the vocational accompaniment focuses on Christian values rooted in all levels of human functioning, and the person's struggle to live these values to the best of his or her ability. In a sense, vocational accompaniment is different from psychotherapy or counseling, which are usually more concerned with, as it were, repairing difficulties if a person has them, or helping the person to live their human values as best they can. And I look at this question later on. In the vocational accompaniment, we ask the searcher to take responsibility for what is discussed in each conversation. We ask the searcher to say what they would like to talk about in terms of their call as they perceive it to live a particular way of life. This means that the searcher initiates the conversation sustains it by ranging over all aspects of his search in a way that is real and appropriate for him or for her. He's also willing to do it, what I would say, in season and out of season. That is, meaning when he feels like talking or when he doesn't, when he thinks he has something to talk about or when he feels he has nothing to say. The role of the vocation minister is to listen with patience and to walk with the searcher tactfully and respectfully, enabling him or her to probe more deeply into areas of life that he, the searcher, brings to the session. And the vocation minister does this through questioning as best he can, using questions, trying to clarify in the responses that he can enter more deeply into understanding what the person is trying to say, challenging the searcher at times, but above all, encouraging. In this way, the vocations minister, through the kind of questions that he asks, through the clarifying in order to understand more deeply, through challenging when he needs to, and through encouragement, in this way creates an atmosphere of trust and safety in which it becomes possible for the searcher, however hesitatingly, especially in the beginning, it becomes possible for the searcher to explore how he is trying to live out what he understands as a call to religious life or to priesthood, how that is he lives that in his day-to-day life. In this safe space, which is created in the mutual interaction between the vocations minister and the searcher, in this safe space, the searcher can explore and reflect on his ideas, feelings, choices, and how they contribute or otherwise to enabling him to greater personal freedom in living Christian values. By the very fact that he is a searcher and is willing to discern his vocation or his call, means that Christian values and how he lives them are very important for him. So the vocation minister, through the accompaniment process, offers the searcher the kind of support and help he needs to acquire a basic lived knowledge and understanding of gospel values as Jesus lived them. He helps the searcher to develop an openness to hearing what God is saying to him, what's being asked of him personally through these values, in terms of understanding himself and his own human response to the demands in daily life. He helps the searcher to grow in an ability to make the necessary sacrifices for a wholehearted response to the call as he perceives it, and to do so with a basic cheerfulness and generosity. And finally, as I said earlier, he will gradually help the person to learn from experience. And he does this by asking the further question. That is, he doesn't always take at face value what the searcher says, but asks him to elaborate, to say something more about what he's saying, to explore it a little bit further, so that he, as the vocation minister, can understand a bit more deeply what the person is trying to say. He will also be alert to responses where he hears the words, yes, but. Very often, like we all of us, I mean, I don't say it's only the searcher, but all of us can say, yes, Lord, but not now, or not in this way. Watch when you hear in a sentence, si, ma, yes, but. Usually behind that word but, there's a conflict going on in the person. Yes, God, I want to follow, I want to do what you're asking. I want to love my neighbor, but not the particular person who's living beside me. So it's there, that in its sense is it's just a simple example of how we listen closely when a searcher is talking to hear what he's actually trying to say, to help him to clarify for himself, ask him, to describe it a little bit more, and encourage where you find that he's doing well or he's able to respond, and challenging in the areas where he doesn't seem to be able to hear what God is saying to him. Just for a minute, let's take a minute to step back and look at, say, counseling and spiritual direction and vocational accompaniment, and see what, very briefly, in what ways they might be similar and in what ways they are different. Counseling, we just look at counseling for a minute. All counseling goals center on changing how people feel, think, or behave so that they can live more effective lives. They can live better, as it were, more effectively as human beings. Counsel, in one part, can be remedial and help the person to recoup losses of earlier stages of development. But counseling, on the other hand, can also be very positive as life skill and assist the process of dealing adaptively with life situations, becoming more fully human. As with vocational accompaniment, counseling stresses respect and value for the person. In addition, both a counselor and the vocation director need a capacity for empathic understanding, learning to empathize and try to understand the person. Respect for the person's current state of being. And thirdly, and this is important for us, being genuinely interested in the other person's welfare. The difference between the two disciplines, the difference between counseling and the vocational accompaniment, lies in the scope and the areas of life that are dealt with. The counselor will always respect the values held by the person, but does not deal with values that are outside the person, as it were. In vocational accompaniment, the ultimate criteria for the integration of life choices are revealed and objective values. That is, the values revealed to us by Jesus Christ. And values that call the person to go beyond their comfort zone for no other motive than love of God and love of neighbor. Spiritual direction can be similar to, but different from, vocational accompaniment. Spiritual direction presupposes a faith life, as does vocational accompaniment, and a basic desire, explicit or otherwise, to grow in openness and in depth in that life. Spiritual direction has been described as an interpersonal relationship in which one person assists others to reflect on their own experience in light of who they're called to become in fidelity to the gospel. So spiritual direction and vocational accompaniment are similar in that both aim to enable the person to deepen and to make their own the values of Jesus Christ. Spiritual direction looks at the interaction between God and the soul. One of the places where this is best seen is in prayer. And spiritual direction touches into the person's responsiveness to God at work in all aspects of life through the exploration of the person's prayer life. Also, spiritual direction, like vocational accompaniment, is a good school to learn to reflect on one's life. Reflection helps the person to take hold of the narrative of his life and to find the meaning that carries them well beyond what he's able to grasp or understand while in the middle of an experience. But the essential difference between vocational accompaniment and spiritual direction is that vocational accompaniment deals with external forum only. Spiritual direction touches the internal forum. Vocational accompaniment also looks specifically to the response in love to the call, the gift that is offered. Spiritual direction is broader in scope. Maybe another difference we could find, though it's not always, is that a person may choose their spiritual director. Usually a vocations accompanier is assigned. However, that's not very important, I think. How is the vocational accompaniment to be carried out? Just one of the things, and I'm sure because I can see many of you must have a lot of experience in vocation, you know, in sort of the vocations ministry, and you'll notice that church documents on vocation ministry, they make huge demands on the formator or the vocations minister. Sometimes I think they seem to think that the vocations minister is a superman or a superwoman. They need to have all the different qualities. And while we have some, we won't have all of them without a doubt. However, just let us look at some of the ways that might be of help in carrying out the ministry, the vocations ministry. And I'll approach this, how we do it, by looking at just a few practical things. First of all, how to structure the accompaniment process and to sustain a conversation. Secondly, we'd look at listening skills. Thirdly, we just look at what happens in an interaction between two people in a situation like vocation accompaniment. What might be the kind of, if I use the psychological term, defense mechanisms that might come into place? What are the kinds of questions that can be helpful and useful in exploring a person's life in greater depth? What do we mean by clarification? What is constructive feedback? Maintaining respectful boundaries is another aspect. And then the other thing is, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, the challenge of a multicultural reality. So I'm just going to look at those different aspects very quickly. And maybe then, yeah, we might be able to see what, where we can go from there. the basic structure of, you know, an accompaniment session. I think that accompaniment works best if it's structured formally. If it's not just simply an informal conversation over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And as I mentioned to you in the beginning, that once a person chooses to go into the process of discerning whether he or she is being called in vocation to priesthood or religious life, it's usually worthwhile to agree to set up to meet at regular intervals. And you don't let those meetings slip. So that would mean that the time and place is decided on between the vocations minister and the searcher. That is a time and place that is mutually convenient for both. So it actually is set up formally. I think that's something that can be quite important, because you're giving to it an importance. You're giving to it something like whereby this is serious, something quite serious that we're working on together. And then the time and place of the meeting is not changed except for exceptional circumstances. From the vocation director's point of view, this means that, like, you know, there's no basic distractions. It can't be, you know, stopped unexpectedly by somebody else coming into a room or something like that. And it gives the vocations director the possibility of holding to the fact that the searcher cannot hide behind, you know, not wanting to talk, not willing to come, not wanting to enter into the conversation. He can't hide behind anything in his search for God's will in his regard and his discernment. In a sense, setting up time and place to meet over a period of time at regular intervals is a discipline. And you'll see how the searcher handles that. And even how the searcher actually handles the whole situation of coming regularly to look at, you know, how he's experiencing the call in his life with another person. You'll find out how he handles that. That'll give you some idea as to how he handle other aspects of his life, say in formation, in initial formation, or even beyond. Secondly, listening. And I mean, I'm sure you've heard this 100 times over and you don't need me to talk to you about it. But like, we have to listen in an accompaniment session, we have to listen actively. And what does that mean? It means actually making a very definite choice as a vocation minister to try to hear what this particular person is trying to communicate about his search, about his effort to respond to the call. You know yourself, and I do, is that if somebody is really listening to me, that helps to build the relationship between myself and the other person. And remember, we don't always listen to each other. I can say to you, good morning, how are you? But I mightn't be ready to hear how you really are this morning. Do we really listen to each other? Sometimes you will have experienced this yourself. When you start to try to communicate something to somebody, the next thing is they'll intervene with, oh yeah, I had an experience like that. And then they move off onto their own experience. They're not really listening to what you say. So watch it. When we talk about listening, it's active listening. You're making a conscious choice to try to hear what the person is saying, but that does help to build a relationship between the searcher and the vocation minister. It also enables the vocation minister to get to know something of the other person. It also helps the searcher to feel that he or she is accepted, is being listened to by this other person. And that in itself is a tremendous encouragement to anybody, that this person is really listening and is really trying to understand what I'm trying to say. It does also help the searcher to take responsibility for what's going on in his or her heart, in his or her relationship with God, and to say it, put it in words to another person. That's not always easy to do. But if I feel that, like, if the searcher feels he's being listened to, really listened to, it enables him to do it and it helps him to grow in confidence. The vocation director listens so that he can understand the other person. He seeks to understand the level of the person's self-awareness. How aware is this man or this woman of himself, of who he is before God? It helps the vocation director to see what level of self-acceptance the person has, what level of understanding, and how these, as it were, work together in the person's search to discern God's calling. And just to say that a way for the vocation minister to deepen an understanding of the other is never presume that you fully understand what the other is trying to say. Don't presume that you fully understand it until you have tried to enter in and to sort of search more deeply. Because it's exploring what's being communicated by asking further questions. By asking, not alone listening to what he's saying, but asking the further question, what did that mean to you? Can you tell me more about that? Can you explore that a little bit further with me? Can you help me to understand what your, say, for example, they're talking about their father, what kind of person your father was? Can you help me to understand a little more? You help the person, you try to help the person to understand something more. Listening requires an atmosphere of respect and hospitality of heart. I really want to get to know this person. And that, again, you communicate that to the other person. It helps the person to open up without a fear of being judged. Also, in listening to the person, we try to mirror back what the person has said by, as it were, rephrasing what the person has said where that's necessary. And we do that without offering our own insights. The vocation minister doesn't offer his own insight and say, this is what I think. He listens to the other. This is what I'm hearing. Is this what I'm hearing you say? He keeps himself out of it or herself out of it. So really, as a vocation minister, we need patience and more patience. Openness to taking the time to trying to understand where the searcher is coming from, where he thinks he ought to go. Trying to empathize is vital in the accompaniment situation. I'd move on to I'd call like the kind of defense mechanisms that come up in a conversation. In any human interaction, as well as in the vocational accompaniment situation, defense mechanisms play their part. And you probably know this already. You probably know what they're like. But just one or two that come up very often when we're dealing with religious vocations. A defense mechanism really is a device that a person will use to avoid conscious recognition of feelings or thoughts that would arouse anxiety for him or for her. They will always interfere to a greater or lesser extent with exploration of issues in a conversation, and particularly in a conversation like between the vocation minister and the searcher. And some of the more likely defenses that you could meet would be one that's technically termed isolation. This happens. Like, what do we really mean by it? This happens when a person describes a feeling rather than expressing a feeling directly. A person finds it very difficult to express feelings. For example, a simple example of such isolation might be, instead of saying, I love you, a person might say something like, you mean a lot to me. Keeps the actual feeling out there a bit from him or her. Or instead of saying something like, how dare you say that to me? If he's angry or she's angry, he might say something like, I want you to realize that I'm getting very annoyed with you. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about when we talk about isolation. So a person who uses this kind of defense will pay more attention to what he or she thinks than to what he or she feels. And, you know, it's important for a person to be in touch with their feelings as well as their thoughts. Another defense, another way of protecting myself against, or protecting oneself against something that will cause anxiety, is what's again technically called reaction formation. But what it does mean in practice is a person gives a response that is the exact opposite to what he or she really feels. For example, a woman who is angry with her mother and who uses the defense of reaction formation would respond to an observation like, say, as the vocation minister, you say, it seems to me that you are a bit angry with your mother. And her reply to you might be something like, how could I be angry with my mother? She's always so loving. Unable to touch into what she's really feeling, and so turns it around to saying, well, I'm not angry. I couldn't be angry because my mother is so loving. Person might be able to talk about what he or she feels, but is unable to explore the reason why. That's what we'd call repression. They're not able to touch the reason why they might be feeling something. So when you'd ask them a question like, what might be the, cause of his feeling or her feeling, the reply invariably is, I don't know. Sometimes a person will resist uncomfortable aspects of a topic by saying to you in the conversation, I've nothing to say today. And this can happen especially if the person feels that there's something coming up to the surface of his or her consciousness that they really don't want to talk about. If it caused them too much anxiety, they'd be afraid of what you might think of them if they were to talk about it. Another example of what can happen in the vocational accompaniment is resistance. It's not that the person consciously is resisting. He or she wants to walk this path of discerning vocation. They have all the goodwill in the world. It's nothing to do with goodwill or bad will or anything like that. But they resist, and again, it doesn't happen consciously. And this is probably the most usual defense that often comes to play when conversations are well underway. Something gets in the way of the conversation that is essential to vocational discernment. The person says he's nothing more to say or will lapse into silence. Resistance is usually unconscious for the person. He may struggle to communicate, but trails off into silence very quickly. And then one other thing, one other type of defense is what we call transference. That is, the searcher, as it were, expresses towards the vocation minister feelings, either positive or negative, that really have nothing to do with the vocation minister himself, but come from a relationship he or she had in the past. I won't go too far into that, but it can happen very often. What about the kind of questions we ask? In a vocational accompaniment, you focus more on the present rather than the past, and therefore what we call open questions are very important. An open question might be something like, what was that like for you? Whereas a more closed question could be something like, how did you feel in that situation? And if you're looking to see if something is really significant or important for the searcher, a question like, I wonder why that's important for you might be helpful. Very often, if you ask something like that, it brings up why the topic or the aspect of the topic is significant for the person. Sometimes a vocation minister might need to challenge a person when he notices inconsistencies between what the person is saying and, say, for example, his or her facial expression. For example, you could say something like this, and remember, when I talk about confrontation, I'm not talking about trying to sort of get the person to change or whatever. It's to get the person to look at what's happening. So, for example, when I'd be challenging a person, you might say something like this. You're speaking about being angry, but you're smiling all the time. Some people smile when they're angry. I don't know if you've noticed that yourself. Have you? Have you ever noticed that? It happens. So, and that's what I mean when I say that, like, for example, the inconsistency between what the person is saying and their actual facial expression. Another thing that might be happening, another way somebody says to you, oh, they're all out to get me. And you might need, like, rephrase a question like that to something like, do you think there might be another way of reading the situation? Getting the person to getting the person to explore what they're saying. If somebody is maybe very defensive about something and say, oh, they're all out to get me. And you, the vocation minister, in helping the person to explore, uses something like, well, do you think there might be another way of reading that situation? When I talk about clarifying, and that's asking the person to sort of describe a little bit further what exactly they're trying to tell you, oftentimes it's very good in that kind of situation to ask for concrete examples. I was feeling anxious, and that's all they say. And you say, well, could you give me an example when that was? How were you? What was it like for you? Who was there? What was going on? Helping the person to explore so that he or she begins to see that, like, questions like that help them to explore and to understand a little more of themselves in a given situation. The other point that comes up is constructive feedback. Bases itself on concrete words and actions so that a person can identify with them and learn from a situation. Generalizations as feedback are never very helpful. For example, it's no good saying to me, "You're an angry person." Can't do anything about that. That doesn't help anybody to learn. When you're walking with somebody, the more important is to help them to notice, like every time, for example, you mention your mother, the sound of your voice gets louder. Or every time you mention maybe somebody else who's, living with them or something like that, the sound of your voice drops. Help the person to notice what's going on and say, why do you think that might be so? Or what do you think's going on there? Or, could you talk to me a bit more about that? Do you ever notice it? When you're trying to give feedback, you give feedback for a concrete situation that you've noticed the person, how the person reacts, how the person responds, and help them then to see what's going on for themselves. Boundaries, well, I mean, I am sure this is something that's always been looked at. The importance of maintaining respectful boundaries in the one-to-one accompaniment is essential. Confidentiality, where appropriate, of course, is always essential. There's no need for me to go into that. And maybe finally, just the multicultural setting. There are multicultural variations in the one-to-one accompaniment setting. There's little need again here for me to highlight for you how important this is in the vocation ministry. Respecting a culture from which each person comes from is paramount. It really is. It's vital. We respect our own culture, but we also respect the culture that the other person comes from. That's very important. And therefore, it means that when we're in a vocational accompaniment session or setting, we're learning all the time. Enculturation is vital, which means not merely tolerating another culture, but also being open to being influenced and learning from the culture. There's also, I won't be going into that because I'm sure you do that in another setting, but there's also intergenerational cultural differences. I mean, we also must take that into account. It's one of the big things in formation is the culture, the intergenerational cultural differences. You also have the congregation culture and the impact that has on a person. And above all, for all of us, all cultures, there's the culture of the gospel and how the gospel challenges all cultures. So as a vocation minister, you'll be aware of the dominant culture in a group of searchers. And aware of your own culture as a vocation minister and the influence that exercises on you. Above all, and I'm going to finish with this because I'm sure you're tired listening to me. Above all, how it affects perception. How I perceive another person is vital in an interaction. For example, if I perceive you as friendly, I'll act towards you as if you were friendly, which draws out a friendly response from you, which confirms me in my belief that you are friendly. Vice versa, if I perceive you to be unfriendly, or if I perceive you to be angry, I will act towards you as if you were, which will draw out an angry response or an unfriendly response, which will confirm me in my perception that you are unfriendly. So remember how we perceive, and this is for the vocation minister, it's vital. how we perceive another culture. And our perceptions aren't always conscious. We've been affected by our perceptions from the very beginning, you know, from the time we were children. Okay, I think I've been talking for a long time. I have left the materials that I have with you so that, I mean, people, I know that if you're trying to listen to this through translation, it's not easy. Even in English, I'm sure it's not easy either. But like, I'll just close it for the moment.